20 years ago, Hurricane Katrina flooded hundreds of thousands of homes in New Orleans.
When Hurricane Katrina made landfall in 2005, the storm killed over 1,800 people and left millions of people displaced.
As it turned out,
This was a terrible tragedy that happened not that long ago. This is actually a very interesting topic because obviously we've had flooding in a variety of locations outside of New Orleans, even though this is the general area in the US that this is particularly problematic. It's also interesting that we actually covered somewhat recently in another video about how the Netherlands and the Dutch basically set up such large infrastructure to combat water levels and flooding. And I think they actually referenced that they work together with local government in New Orleans to actually set up some blockades as well. So I'm actually very curious, especially considering there are other countries and other locations in the world where flooding is such a ubiquitous problem. New Orleans is definitely one of those areas for us in the US, and I'm very curious to see if they have been able to solve this in some capacity, because this could be very useful for other areas that are starting to see more and more flooding issues as weather gets more extreme.
it wasn't so much the hurricane that devastated New Orleans, it was the failure of the levees that were supposedly protecting the city.
In the aftermath, the city's problem with blight intensified. Approximately 25% of the city's housing stock was vacant or abandoned.
As people started to come back in and redevelop, property values shot up like crazy.
We've got an affordability crisis.
We also still have a tremendous number of houses that have not been rebuilt and some not even touched since the storm 20 years ago.
Some parts of the city, like the Superdome, have bounced back quickly. 30,000 people sheltered in the building after the storm.
It was just crisis after crisis.
The U.S. government has so far spent billions to rebuild homes, restore infrastructure, and fortify the levee system.
We've improved over 300 plus miles of levees. We've rebuilt over 71 miles of barrier islands.
At the heart of the plan was a $15 billion upgrade for the region's hurricane protection system. But the Army Corps says billions more may be needed to counteract the region's slow descent into the sea. Meanwhile, insurance premiums are spiking in disaster-prone areas like California, Florida, and Louisiana. CNBC traveled to New Orleans ahead of the Super Bowl to investigate. How can a city rebuild its neighborhoods as it sinks? When Hurricane Katrina made landfall in 2005, New Orleans proper incurred an estimated $40 billion in damages. Few areas were more affected than the lower Ninth Ward. Just 1/3 of the population returned to the neighborhood as of 2023.
There was always a feeling that we were on the other side of the canal. Sewer systems weren't what you thought would be. There were public spaces we couldn't access.
Major industrial waterways were built in this area at various points of the 20th century. The Army Corps was responsible for the flood walls that failed.
This is probably the hardest hit area of the city with the amount of water that came in.
Calvin Alexander has lived near the lower Ninth Ward for decades in a higher elevation neighborhood called Holy Cross.
In my house, I think we probably had 4 or 5 feet of water in the house. We had private insurance. We also had flood insurance. And the private insurance was so slow in settling the claims. We went ahead and took the flood insurance money, replaced my roof and gutters. And it actually was over 5 years before the insurance company settled that claim.
In the lower...
Wow. He had to wait 5 years for them to settle that claim. That's such an outrageous amount of time. For these individuals who are in these scenarios, you could be without a home. It sounded like maybe that individual's home was not totally lost, like some others might have been, but imagine having a home and having all your belongings there and losing potentially all of it, and then having to wait 5 years to be able to get some of those things back. Like, you could be in a completely terrible situation for those 5 years. You might not even be able to move back into that home or be able to afford that home afterwards. That seems outrageous that they're able to delay resolving claims that long. Seems like there should be some regulation on that.
Elevation parts of the neighborhood, many homeowners couldn't afford to rebuild.
It's not financially viable to make investments without subsidies in the lower Ninth Ward because it costs now more to build the house than it is worth.
And of course, whenever there's a storm where there's major damage, building materials go up. I can remember For example, a roll of wire to do your rewire your electricity. At the beginning of the storm, a roll of that wire ran about $175, $180. Within 2.5 years, that was $400 a roll. Everything shot up that way.
Official records show relatively low rates of new housing construction in most years since Katrina. As a result, New Orleans is now facing a housing crisis, particularly in neighborhoods on high ground like Holy Cross. The assessed value of Mr. Alexander's property has more than tripled since 2005. In the same time frame, home prices across the metro area have increased nearly 71%, and national home prices have increased 84%.
Property value in some instances have really increased.
Brenda Breaux is the executive director of the New Orleans Redevelopment.
Hopefully they'll explain that, because that's not what I would have expected at all, especially considering the average here. I think they highlighted it was actually a little bit lower for New Orleans, which would make sense to me. If I'm in another part of the country, I'd probably not be choosing New Orleans as a place to move into just because they've had so many issues with hurricanes and flooding over time. It's curious how this one individual's home value skyrocketed during the same time frame, even outpacing other areas on average in the US.
71%, and national home prices have increased 84%.
Property value in some instances have really increased.
Brenda Breaux is the executive director of the New Orleans Redevelopment Authority. The group acquires distressed and vacant properties and repurposes them. They've turned blighted properties into new housing, federally backed health centers, and community space.
We had nearly 6,000 vacant lots and in some instances properties across the city of New Orleans. Today, we're right under 1,000, about 968 properties remaining.
Most of the remaining properties are in low-income areas. The typical household in New Orleans earns $55,000 a year. That's lower than the national median. The biggest industries in New Orleans are trade, transportation, and utilities, alongside education, health, leisure, and hospitality. In recent years, the job market within New Orleans has been tepid at best. Economists at LSU believe that the trend will continue into 2025.
We're a tourist city. People turning over hotel room beds, people pouring drinks in the French Quarter. We're not going to support any of those folks. We're just going to take their houses away from them, give them nowhere to live that's affordable, and still rely on them and their work to keep this economy, the machinery of this city's economy functioning. It's outrageous.
To help New Orleans residents rebuild their homes after Katrina, the state of Louisiana created a program.
And the program is called the Road Home Program. It's the largest housing reconstruction project in U.S. history.
The program, partly financed by the federal government, provided over $9 billion in compensation to homeowners. They could use the cash to rebuild, or they could take the money and turn the property over to the government. The Road Home Program was criticized for its complexity and its role in making it harder for low-income families to rebuild.
Instead of basing settlements on damage to property and estimated cost to rebuild, they threw out all of that data and went with pre-storm property value instead. So if you owned a home in a low wealth neighborhood, like, let's say the lower Ninth Ward, your property value was immediately something like 25% of the average.
Many of the properties left abandoned after road home payouts were transferred to the Redevelopment Authority.
Nora is faced with a tremendous opportunity and a tremendous problem after the storm. They own entire neighborhoods essentially, and they had to figure out how do we get these properties back into commerce without completely shocking the market.
We were thoughtful when we disposed of those properties. We made properties available to individuals who were the adjacent property owners.
You had an opportunity to double the land area that you had. And fundamentally, it ends up really benefiting some neighborhoods and not others.
The terms of the program left many low-income residents with large debts. The federal government forgave those debts in 2023. Still, many homeowners in the area struggle to afford repair and maintenance for their rooftops, windows, and siding.
You have a lot of blighted property, empty property. Give them a little grant, and we come here to fix the house, and you have somewhere to stay. We would have no homeless. That'll solve all the problems with homelessness.
The land that became New Orleans started as a trading post on high ground along the Mississippi River. The city grew out from the French Quarter into nearby swamps with the introduction of pumping systems.
Yeah, this seems to be such a recurring problem in this area. It's unfortunate to hear that there were so many issues with folks being able to get out of those areas. I think one of the key ones there was they highlighted that people were reimbursed for their homes based off of the property value beforehand. On one side, I could see that being the case because obviously if an individual basically invested, let's say $100,000 into a property, and then you handed them the same amount as somebody else who invested $200,000 into a property and said, okay, both of you get $200,000 regardless of what you originally gave, then obviously you would be disproportionately handing it over to lower income folks. I think that's still reasonable overall because the goal was to support people who lived in these areas to move to other areas. So I think it is reasonable for them to have used relocation as basically the average number, or rebuilding as the number that they use to hand out and support these individuals. But I can see a case where they were trying to distribute money evenly. It's possible they didn't have enough funding to give everyone the same amount or a minimal amount to completely rebuild a home someplace else, and you'd have to make a decision on how do you distribute it. And so you could have either chosen, we're going to distribute to everyone evenly, and then in this case, basically maybe everybody's shy of being able to build out a new home in a new location, in which case the people who were the poorest were still going to struggle. Like, let's say there wasn't enough to do 200,000. So for these two individuals that I highlighted in this theoretical scenario, one put in 100,000, one put 200,000 in beforehand. They each get 150,000, but it costs 200,000 to build a new home. Then the richer individual might have an extra 50,000 available to them through loans or other vehicles to rebuild their home, but the poorer individual might not. And so while they're getting a larger sum, they still might not have been able to get a home. And so these are some of those issues that they didn't really cover at all on like how this decision was concluded and how they got to that point. So there are multiple factors at play. I think it is unfortunate that those folks didn't get what they need, but it seems like they just sort of underreported how that came about.
As a result, about half of the city sits below sea level. Low-lying areas flood often.
It'll flood cars, it'll keep people from getting to work, it'll flood homes. It is not a federal issue, but will take probably continued federal investment to get out of.
Making matters worse, the population is still declining quickly. A declining population means a declining tax base and funding issues within local government.
Pre-Katrina, the city had 503,000 people. We're at 356,000 now.
As a result, the city government, the municipal government, needs to raise a lot more money, which means property taxes increase pretty regularly for people, which is a big burden.
We've always...
Yeah, I think this has happened in other areas as well, which is the folks who don't have enough money to move are the ones who are sort of stuck in these areas that are not as good for them financially. Like maybe there's less opportunities, maybe there's more environmental risk. And so the folks with means to move do move. And it's the folks who don't have the means that end up getting stuck there. So maybe with that being the case, if the goal of the government is to move everybody out, then they should have given more funding potentially to the folks who were less financially able. But it does seem like they're having some mixed messaging here. It seems like some folks are still trying to pass that land along. Like they said, they're allowing their neighbors to buy that empty lot, maybe extend their property lines. And so they seem to have this sort of dichotomy of saying that they should have enabled folks to move out, but then they're also kind of encouraging them to treat people differently and to support a growing community in this area. And so this is something that I'm struggling with personally. I feel like they should have probably invested in one way or the other, but they seem to be doing both, and it's hurting them, where if they're supporting some people to leave, then it's hurting and minimizing the resources that could go to whoever stays. And then vice versa, where if you invested more to invest in that area and keep folks there, then you probably have less money to support people evacuating that area. So this is where it's hard to see which one is the right one or not. This isn't really my background, so I'm not sure what the right answer is here, but it seems odd to me that they're sort of playing both sides of this at the same time instead of just putting all of their resources towards one direction.
It's underfunded, and we've always developed in contrary to what nature says we should do.
Flood insurance policies in New Orleans cost about $800 a year on average. That's actually less than what it should be to cover the risks associated with property, according to the federal government. Many other parts of the Gulf Coast have this problem too. Even if the government spends billions to preserve the coast, large swaths of land could disappear. As parts of the region sink, the Army Corps is led on rebuilding its flood protection systems.
And so it is a complex system of levees, floodgates, pump stations, and flood walls that really help to protect New Orleans and reduce risk.
The state plans to spend $50 billion over the next 50 years to update the system. The system got a test when Hurricane Ida made landfall in 2021.
Ida did impact New Orleans to some degree, but as you look across the coast, they were impacted obviously more. And so what we're seeing now from building these systems is that we're getting $7 of benefit for every dollar we spend on these hurricane protection systems.
The pumps that we have now and the levee protection system that we have now is...
That sounded like a great point that he made there, which is they're actually seeing more return from protecting the area than trying to resolve issues afterwards, which makes a lot of sense to me. Obviously, I think in some cases there's like a dollar of preparation is worth like $3 or $5 of repair. And so this makes sense. Trying to prevent a home from being destroyed or entire communities being destroyed would potentially save you a lot of money. It does leave me wondering why they haven't invested more if they have this scenario for them where they know that they'll actually earn money by investing and protecting the area. It seems like they should just keep funneling money to it.
Is exponentially better than what we had, but as we go further into an era of more severe rain, no system in the world can keep up with that volume of water.
Meanwhile,
yeah, this is somewhat of what I was referencing earlier, which is, as far as I can tell, with global warming and things like that, this is going to become a much larger issue for everyone. And so areas that are not known for flooding, like New Orleans, are starting to get flooded now. And so this does seem to be a growing issue for certainly the US and I'm sure other parts of the world as well.
Today's leaders in Washington are reconsidering how disaster aid is administered.
And we're looking at the whole concept of FEMA. I like, frankly, the concept when North Carolina gets hit, the governor takes care of it. When Florida gets hit, the governor takes care of it, meaning the state takes care of it.
Back at the local level, groups are doing what they can with the resources at their disposal.
If I walk down Aretha Castle Haley, you see a vibrant corridor. I'm not going to suggest that it's 100% or we're complete, but I can certainly tell you from where I sit today, from where we were 12 years ago, you can see the change and the trajectory that has taken place.
Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, please hit like or subscribe. I will see you around.